Welcome to today's historical deep dive. Today we don't just tell history, we unpack the colossal egos that shaped it. And few figures cast a longer, more complicated shadow than Napoleon Bonaparte. Prepare to step beyond the battle maps and into the mind of a man who thought he could crown himself destiny. If you love immersive, real storytelling about ambition and downfall, hit like and subscribe. It helps us more than you know. Drop a comment with your favorite Napoleon quote or the moment that shocked you most. Let's begin and change the way you think about history. You stand in the vast, echoing silence of Notre Dame on December 2nd, 1804. The air is thick with the scent of incense and the crushing weight of centuries of history. It's cold, despite the throng of Europe's elite. Cardinals rustle in their robes. Generals stiffen in their uniforms. Ambassadors watch with a mix of awe and apprehension. All eyes converge on the man kneeling before the altar. His frame surprisingly small against the cathedral's immensity. This isn't a moment of humble supplication for a divine blessing. It's the apex of a meticulously staged spectacle. Napoleon Bonaparte, already first consul for life, prepares for his final audacious metamorphosis from revolutionary general to emperor. The crown, a heavy circlet designed to evoke the symbols of Charlemagne and Roman emperors past, rests nearby. The Pope, Pius VII, is present, but you feel the strange tension. He is not here to bestow legitimacy in the traditional sense. Napoleon rises. He does not wait for the Pope's hand to place the sacred symbol upon his head. Instead, with deliberate, unhesitating motion, he takes the crown himself and places it firmly upon his own brow. But chill ripples through the onlookers. This is not a consecration. It is a declaration unlike any they have witnessed. This man believes his destiny is not granted by God, nor inherited by blood, nor even truly given by the people he purports to serve. It is self-made, self-ordained. He didn't wait for validation. He seized it, physically enacting his supreme belief in his own singular authority. The insight here is profound, bordering on terrifying. The moment a leader believes their power and authority stems solely from themselves, recognizing no higher power, no divine right, no accountability to the very people they rule, they step onto a dangerous precipice. Napoleon's act of self-coronation wasn't just theater. It symbolized the core principle that would define his empire and ultimately orchestrate its collapse, an unshakable, all-consuming belief in his own exceptionalism and the absolute right to command without question. It was the final, decisive break from the pragmatic, calculating revolutionary general. In that moment, the insatiable imperial ego was born. Consider the reflection this offers us today. Greatness achieved through service, necessity, or genuine popular will is one thing. Greatness claimed, taken through sheer force of will and absolute self-belief, invites challenges from every corner. For a leader who recognizes no authority above their own reflection, inevitably finds themselves isolated, facing a world that refuses to bow to a single unchecked will. Was this brilliance born of necessity or simply unparalleled hubris? You remember the chaos that came before. The promises of liberty, equality, fraternity, shouted from the rooftops of a collapsing monarchy, had curdled into the blood-soaked madness of the Reign of Terror. The guillotine fell, not just on kings and nobles, but on revolutionaries themselves. Instability became the air you breathed. Then came the Directory. 5 men meant to steer the ship of state, but who steered it instead into a mire of corruption, inefficiency, and endless political squabbling. France felt adrift, exhausted by a decade of upheaval and seemingly perpetual war against a hostile Europe. Society wasn't just weary, it was desperate. It craved a return to normalcy, a firm hand to stop the bleeding, to silence the shouting factions, to bring food back to the markets and soldiers home from the frontiers. The Directory offered none of this. They were figures of ridicule, symbols of a revolution that had lost its way, replaced by opportunism and self-interest. You watched, disillusioned, as the grand ideals dissolved into petty power struggles. When news reached you of a general, fresh from campaigns in Italy and Egypt, staging a coup d'état in November 1799, the 18th of Brumaire in the new calendar, a weary hope flickered. This wasn't a return to the monarchy, no king seizing power. This was Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who had risen not through birthright, but through military genius, through sheer force of will on the battlefield. He promised not abstract ideals, but concrete results. Stability, order, an end to the turmoil. He spoke of unity, of rebuilding France, of restoring its glory. He delivered, at least initially. Peace treaties were signed, bringing temporary respite from the wars. He oversaw the drafting of a new constitution, consolidating power, but promising a pathway to order. He began the monumental task of codifying French law, a project that would bring clarity and uniformity where chaos had reigned. He invested in infrastructure, building roads and canals, laying the groundwork for future prosperity. He was the strongman France desperately needed, or so it overwhelmingly seemed to those tired of uncertainty. Here is the profound and often tragic irony. Power doesn't just seize vacuums, it is often invited into them. When people are exhausted by insecurity, when disillusionment erodes faith in democratic processes, they become willing to trade essential liberties for the promise of stability. Napoleon understood this fundamental human desire for order. He wasn't merely a usurper. He was, in many ways, the answer to a collective cry for salvation from chaos. Ask yourself now, when does the desire for security tip over into a willingness to sacrifice freedom? And is the order brought by centralized, almost absolute control ever truly stable, or does it merely postpone the inevitable reckoning? The strongman brings results, but at what hidden cost to the soul of a nation? You are now first consul, the savior of France after the chaos. But saving a nation requires more than military victories. It demands building. And you, the whirlwind general, prove to be an architect of startling efficiency. Step inside the Tuileries Palace. The battlefield's roar is replaced by the scratching of pens, the rustle of decrees. You work 14, 16 hours a day, poring over budgets, cadastral surveys, legal drafts. France isn't just a map of strategic points. It's a broken machine needing repair, and you approach it with the same ruthless logic applied to troop movements. You witness the birth of the Civil Code, the Code Napoleon, not a dusty relic, but a revolutionary blueprint for modern law, simplifying, standardizing, imposing order on generations of contradictory regional customs. Property rights, family law, contracts. You demand clarity, accessibility. You weren't a lawyer, but you drove the process, questioning, understanding, shaping. It's a legal framework that will echo across Europe, across the world, for centuries. This wasn't conquest by arms, but conquest by logic, a softer, more insidious form of power. Then comes the Bank of France, stabilizing a volatile economy, ravaged by assignats and instability. The centralized prefect system, replacing fragmented local authorities with direct links to Paris, extending your will, your vision, to the furthest corners of the nation. Lycées, the state-controlled secondary schools, designed to train loyal administrators and soldiers, crafting the future elite in your image. Every institution, every reform, is a piece of a grand, interlocking system designed for efficiency, control, and national strength. You are the ultimate CEO, demanding data, results, loyalty. Every detail matters, from tax collection methods to the curriculum taught in schools. Your authority isn't just enforced by grenadiers. It permeates through administrative structures, through legal codes, through economic policy. France feels a sense of purpose, a directed energy it hasn't known since before the revolution began devouring its children. There's a quiet strength in this period, a sense of constructive genius that often gets lost in the thunder of cannons. This era reveals a profound truth. Order, even imposed order, can feel like progress after chaos. Competent administration builds a different kind of power. Not affection, perhaps, but a grudging respect, a dependence from a populace benefiting from predictability and functioning services. This was Napoleon at his most constructively powerful, building the engine that would later fuel his military machine. But pause. Admire the efficiency, the sheer administrative brilliance, the scope of the reforms. Then ask yourself, what was the cost of this order? Did this centralized machine truly empower the people, or did it merely make them more efficient, more controllable cogs in a streamlined system directed from the top, paving the way for absolute rule? Was the Code Napoleon an emancipation, or just a more elegant cage? But Consul for life, you soon realize, is a title built on sand. The air grows thick with whispers, conspiracies, some real, some phantoms born of fear, coil around the Tuileries. The question hangs heavy in the drawing rooms and the barracks. What happens when you die? The specter of chaos, the return to the maelstrom you just calmed, haunts the fragile peace. The factions, never truly vanquished, stir. Bourbon monarchists plot in shadowed drawing rooms, dreaming of a restored king. Earnest Republicans, disillusioned by the centralizing power, grumble about lost ideals. The Jacobins, ever volatile, see that the stifling of their revolutionary fervor. France, you see, is still a volatile crucible. This instability is not just a threat, it is an opportunity. The argument solidifies. France needs permanence, a bedrock against the tide of internal strife and external aggression. A single life, however brilliant, is too fragile a foundation for the future of a nation forged in revolution. You watch the pieces on the board, the fear of the unknown, the fatigue of constant upheaval, and see the path forward. The empire, it is presented not as a coronation, but as a fortification, a logical, even necessary, conclusion to secure the gains of the revolution, your interpretation of them, naturally. You frame it as the only shield strong enough to protect France from the vengeful monarchies abroad and the centrifugal forces within. It is national security elevated to a constitutional principle. Continuity embodied in a dynasty, a promotion justified by success and the desperate need for stability. You don't seize a crown, you accept a burden, a necessity for the nation's survival. The deeper insight here, the chilling logic, is the masterful leverage of fear and uncertainty. You amplify the threats, real or perceived, until the expansion of your own authority seems not ambitious, but essential. The transition from elected official, validated by popular vote, to hereditary emperor is sold as the ultimate safeguard. The republic, ironically, must become an empire to survive itself. Ask yourself, how often do leaders, even today, emphasize external enemies and internal saboteurs? How often is increased power, diminished dissent, presented as the only way to ensure your safety, your stability, the very survival of the nation? Beware the siren song of security when it calls for the surrender of scrutiny. This transformation is the moment the pragmatic defender becomes the imperial architect, laying the foundation for a palace built on the anxieties of a people. You stand beneath the vaulted arches of Notre Dame, the air thick with incense and expectation. This isn't a religious ceremony. It's the imperial theater, a performance on a scale Europe hasn't witnessed in centuries. Every detail is curated, every participant a player in a carefully orchestrated drama, designed to declare a new era, a new dynasty. You see the elaborate robes, heavier than any armor, symbols designed to blend revolutionary achievement with ancient imperial tradition. The golden bees, thousands of them embroidered onto the crimson velvet, replace the Bourbon fleur-de-lis, speaking not just of industriousness, but of ancient Frankish kings, whispering of immortality and a lineage forged not by divine right, but by sheer will and conquest. The Roman fasces, bundles of rods bound around an axe, symbols of state power, unity, and the magistrate's authority to punish, are everywhere, a blunt assertion of secular might, cloaked in classical legitimacy. The sheer expense is astronomical, a display of France's renewed wealth and Napoleon's boundless ambition. Dignitaries from across Europe are required attendees, summoned not to witness, but to acknowledge. This wasn't just about Napoleon becoming emperor. It was about looking and feeling like an emperor, projecting an image of unassailable power and destiny onto the global stage. And then the moment arrives. Pope Pius VII is present, but Napoleon takes the crown not from the pontiff's hands, but places it upon his own head and then upon Josephine's. A subtle yet profound moment of tragic irony, claiming the mantle of centuries of emperors while simultaneously asserting the state's supremacy over the church, a revolutionary principle now used to legitimize an imperial throne. This single act underscores the core insight of this grand performance. Power isn't just held, it must be projected. It must be seen, felt, believed. The coronation wasn't for Napoleon alone. It was a visual argument for his legitimacy, a carefully crafted illusion designed to legitimize his rule in the eyes of the skeptical monarchies, and silence lingering dissent within France. It was for France, for Europe, for history itself, a narrative spun in gold, velvet, and steel. Recognize the power of symbols and narratives in politics and leadership. They are not mere decoration. They are weapons and tools of persuasion. What stories are being told in the world around you? What images are being projected by those who seek influence or control? Do they reflect reality, or are they carefully crafted illusions designed to manipulate perception and consent? Ask yourself, how much of what you see is genuine power, and how much is just spectacular theater? You stand upon the newly constructed imperial throne, the weight of the crown a physical manifestation of your ambition realized. The veneer of republicanism, thin as it was under the consulate, begins to crack and peel away entirely. As first consul, you at least went through the motions of consultation, the Council of State a forum for debate, even if you held the final word. Now, as emperor, the title itself shifts something within you, a subtle poison of unquestioned authority. Decisions flow not from deliberation, but from a single, all-encompassing will, your own. France transforms, almost imperceptibly at first, then undeniably, into Napoleon's personal domain. Its vast resources, its energetic manpower, become tools in your hand, sharp and ready, wielded solely for the advancement of your vision. The once vibrant debates within the Council of State fade into an echo chamber, voices carefully calibrated to resonate with the emperor's known desires. Your marshals, battle-hardened and fiercely loyal, learn the bitter lesson that contradicting the emperor on strategy, even subtly, risks disgrace. Fear, a quiet, insidious thing, settles into the gilded halls of power. The press, once a thorn, is now a tightly controlled instrument, singing only praises or absolute silence. You feel the strange, heavy cloak of this centralized control, the chilling absence of genuinely independent voices. This is the often overlooked, tragic irony of achieving ultimate power: isolation. The emperor, at the peak of his authority, becomes a solitary figure on a remote mountain, surrounded by those who ascend only to reflect his own image. Sycophants flourish in the imperial glare, eager to agree, unwilling to challenge, even when your strategic intuition, once so sharp, begins to falter under the weight of ego. The critical feedback, the dissenting opinion that prunes bad ideas and strengthens good ones, withers and dies in this environment. A leader who consciously or unconsciously surrounds themselves only with yes-men is not gaining strength. They are choosing to walk blindfolded into the future, their own judgment distorted by unchallenged certainty. Ask yourself, is true leadership about absolute command, or does it require the humility to listen to dissenting voices, the wisdom to value perspectives wildly different from your own? Could Napoleon's later, costlier missteps be traced back not just to overreach, but to the profound isolation that the imperial crown ultimately imposed upon him? The emperor had the world at his feet, but lost sight of the ground beneath them. You stand on the chilling plains of Moravia, December 2nd, 1805. The air bites, thick with a morning mist that obscures the landscape, a white shroud over destiny. Before you, arrayed in a massive, undulating line, are the combined armies of Emperors Francis of Austria and Tsar Alexander of Russia. They outnumber your forces, their confidence buoyed by sheer mass, yet your own ambition burns brighter than the weak winter sun struggling to pierce the fog. Barely a year has passed since you placed the crown upon your own head in Notre Dame, a moment of breathtaking audacity that defied millennia of tradition. Now, Here, on this field near a small village called Austerlitz, that self-proclaimed authority faces its ultimate test. The tension is a palpable thing, vibrating in the cold air. Your marshals await your orders, their faces a mix of apprehension and fierce loyalty. You see the fog clinging stubbornly to the Pratzen Heights, the strategic key to the battlefield. The enemy, seeing your seemingly weak right flank, is already committing troops there, lured by the promise of an easy breakthrough. This is it. This is the moment the trap springs. You didn't just mobilize France's resources. You bent the entire nation to your will, summoning men and supplies with unprecedented speed and scale. The Grand Army isn't just an army. It's the embodiment of your empire's focused energy, ready to be unleashed. Your masterstroke unfolds with chilling precision. While the Allies drain strength from their center to attack your weak right, your main force, hidden by the mist, begins its ascent of the Pratzen Heights. It's like a massive, silent wave rising from the sea. As the fog lifts, the sun breaks through, illuminating the scene, the famous Sun of Austerlitz. The sight of your troops swarming the heights, appearing as if from nowhere, shatters the enemy's composure. Their center, now fatally exposed, buckles under the onslaught. This isn't just a frontal assault. It's a hammer blow delivered with the force of a nation's singular purpose. The Battle of the Three Emperors becomes a rout. The Allied lines disintegrate, their commanders caught completely by surprise by the speed and scale of the attack on the critical central position. The pursuit is relentless, merciless. Fleeing Russian troops are cornered, some attempting to escape across frozen ponds to the south, a detail sometimes embellished in legend, claiming your artillery shattered the ice, drowning thousands, a chilling though perhaps exaggerated symbol of the battle's finality. Regardless of the exact numbers lost to the freezing water, the message is clear. The victory is devastatingly complete. It is total war, executed with total authority. Austerlitz isn't just a military triumph. It's a political earthquake. It validates everything. Your self-coronation, initially met with skepticism and resentment by the old monarchies, is now undeniable reality. The emperor's vision, the emperor's will, executed by the emperor's army, has crushed the combined might of two great empires. It feels like absolute authority. When wielded by a mind capable of such strategic foresight and supported by an efficient, centralized state, is unstoppable. Look at the sheer, terrifying power of it. A single brilliant mind directing the movement of tens of thousands, orchestrating a complex dance of deception and brute force that dictates the fate of nations. The victory resonates across Europe, forcing Austria to terms, dissolving the Holy Roman Empire the following year, and cementing France as the dominant power on the continent. It seems the empire stands unshakable, built on the bedrock of military glory. But ask yourself, what is the true cost of this glory? Not just in the thousands of bodies left frozen on the plains, the sons and fathers and husbands from France, Austria, and Russia. What does it mean for a nation to be bent so completely to the will of one man, no matter how brilliant? Austerlitz proves the astonishing results achievable when genius is fused with absolute power and unparalleled efficiency. It is the zenith of the empire's military strength, a breathtaking display of Napoleon's strategic mastery. Yet in this moment of ultimate triumph, does the terrifying potential for such power to be turned to less noble, perhaps even self-destructive ends, begin to emerge? Witness the terrifying power of a single brilliant mind in command of vast resources. But also ask, what is the cost of such glory, measured not in captured flags, but in blood and suffering, and the potential for such power to be turned to less noble ends? This victory, so absolute, so intoxicating, plants seeds that will one day blossom into a far more bitter harvest. Austerlitz was merely the opening act. Jena, Auerstedt, Friedland. Each victory is a hammer blow against the old world, shattering its foundations. You watch as the maps of Europe don't just change color. They are torn up and drawn anew with audacious strokes. The Holy Roman Empire, that sprawling ancient ghost that had haunted the continent for a millennium, is finally, definitively dissolved. 1,000 years of history erased with a pen stroke, a treaty signed under duress. In its place, a constellation of new entities emerges. The Confederation of the Rhine, pulling German states into Paris's orbit. The Kingdom of Italy, unified under French rule. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a tantalizing hint of a Polish future. Europe is no longer a collection of independent powers, but a vast, intricate chessboard, and Napoleon sees himself as the master player. His pieces, his brothers, his marshals, placed on newly created thrones from Naples to Westphalia. You see Louis on the throne of Holland, Joseph in Naples and later Spain, Jerome in Westphalia. It's a dazzling, bewildering display of family power extended by conquest. This isn't just about winning battles. It's about total environmental control. The insight crystallizes before you. Unchecked power, drunk on victory, inevitably seeks to expand beyond its borders, to mold the world in its own image. Napoleon's ambition is no longer merely French. It is continental, imperial. He genuinely believes he can impose his will, his systems, the civil code. The continental system, across diverse nations and cultures. He views Europe as something to be managed, administered, and controlled from the center of his expanding empire in Paris. There is a tragic irony here. The revolutionary general who promised liberty and equality is now the emperor imposing his rule, his family, his blockades upon unwilling populations. The architect of the Code Civil, meant to bring order and justice, is now dissolving ancient kingdoms and installing relatives as rulers. The clarity of cause and effect is stark. Military dominance fuels a belief in total political control, leading to an attempt to unilaterally redesign a complex continent. This relentless pressure, this top-down restructuring, demonstrates the inherent danger in believing one entity can understand and control intricate organic systems. You see the seeds of future resistance sown even now, in the quiet resentments building beneath the surface of forced alliances and imposed rulers. Ask yourself, when you witness Napoleon's total confidence in reshaping Europe, dissolving thousand-year-old entities, and placing his family on thrones, is this the height of strategic genius, or the intoxicating blindness of absolute hubris? Consider the fragility of systems built purely on power, without the consent or genuine integration of the people they govern. This moment isn't just history, It's a stark warning about the unforeseen resistance that arises when complexity is treated as mere clay to be molded by a single, unchallenged hand. The empire expands, a vast, intricate machine turning under your hand, stretching across continents. Yet paradoxically, the more the world bows to your will, the smaller your own personal sphere becomes. You sit late into the night, papers piled high like miniature mountains on your desk in the Tuileries or Fontainebleau. 16-hour days become the norm, a relentless, suffocating routine where every detail, from the movement of armies in Spain to the specific lines allowed in a Parisian play, falls under your microscopic gaze. This isn't just diligence, it's the tightening grip of a man who trusts fewer and fewer souls with the levers of his colossal power. The faces around you change. Marshals who once stood shoulder to shoulder with you in the smoke and chaos of battle, whose loyalty was forged in blood and victory, now find themselves eyed with suspicion. Their counsel, once vital, is dismissed, their reputations publicly tarnished for minor errors or perceived slights. Trust, the bedrock of any command structure, begins to crumble, replaced by a chilling reliance solely on your own judgment. Men who navigated the viper's nest of pre-revolutionary politics, giants like Talleyrand, your limping, brilliant foreign minister, whose cynicism was as sharp as a stiletto, are slowly but surely pushed to the margins. His pragmatic, often unwelcome assessments of reality become unbearable when you feel reality should conform to your decrees. Fouché, the shadowy, omnipresent police chief, whose network of spies reached into every drawing room and tavern, is feared not just by the populace, but by you yourself. His independent power base, his sheer cunning, make him an ultimate threat, and he too is eventually cast out. This is the chilling consequence of unchecked power. It breeds a profound, corrosive distrust. When you are the absolute authority, every dissenting opinion, every cautious word can feel like a challenge to your very supremacy. The vast palaces, filled with courtiers eager only to please and affirm, become gilded cages of isolation. Uncomfortable truths, the warnings carried by men like Talleyrand or Fouché, who understood the ground reality, are filtered out, softened, or simply never delivered. You are shielded from the inconvenient, surrounded by echoes of your own convictions. It's a tragic irony. The ambition that conquered nations isolates the conqueror from the vital intelligence and diverse perspectives needed to govern them wisely. The master strategist becomes blind, locked inside a fortress of his own making, its walls impermeable, not just to enemies, but to the very insights that could save him. Ask yourself, when surrounded by yes-men, how does a leader truly see the storm gathering on the horizon? What would you do, standing at that pinnacle, feeling the pressure to be infallible, knowing that admitting uncertainty or seeking counsel might be perceived as weakness? The willingness to hear uncomfortable truths isn't a deficit of strength. It is, perhaps, the ultimate act of courage for one who holds absolute power. This self-imposed isolation, this inability to hear the warnings, plants the seeds for future, devastating missteps. You stand surveying the map of Europe, a complex game board where every nation is a piece, and Britain, across the water, remains the most elusive, the most dangerous. You cannot invade them directly, not yet. So, you devise another strategy, a grand economic siege, the continental system. The core historical decision here is not just its conception, but your unwavering commitment to its rigid enforcement. You decree that no British goods, no ships trading with Britain, shall touch the shores of any nation under your sway or under the sway of those you persuade to join. It is meant to be the chokehold that starves the British lion into submission, bringing that mercantile island nation to its knees without firing a single cannonade across the channel. This is imperial ambition, translating into a sweeping, all-encompassing policy aimed at rewriting the rules of global commerce. But reality, as always, is messier than a decree on paper. This system, this seemingly logical move on your strategic chessboard, quickly becomes a perfect, painful example of overreach. While Britain certainly feels the pinch, the true deep wound is inflicted not upon your arch-enemy, but upon your own allies and client states. Their economies, deeply intertwined with British trade for generations, begin to suffocate. Ports lie idle, merchants face ruin. The absence of British colonial goods, sugar, coffee, cotton, creates widespread shortages and drives prices sky high. A surprising detail, often overlooked, is that this economic war hurt the very nations you needed most for stability and support far more severely than it dealt a crippling blow to Britain, which found new markets elsewhere or saw its manufacturing sector spurred to innovate for internal demand. The system fosters resentment like a persistent weed. Forced compliance breeds not loyalty, but defiance. Smuggling becomes a massive, organized enterprise across the entire coastline of Europe, an underground economy thriving in defiance of your authority. The system, born of a desire for control, becomes a constant draining source of friction, requiring ever more troops needed elsewhere to patrol vast coastlines, hunt smugglers, and pressure reluctant rulers. You find yourself trapped in a cycle. The more you try to impose this rigid, top-down system without considering local needs or incentives, the more resistance you generate, pushing reluctant partners like Russia further and further away, eroding the alliances that are the very foundation of your empire. It's a grand plan, dictated by one will, ignoring the complex, interconnected realities on the ground, generating widespread resistance and undermining the very foundations it was built upon. What would you have done standing in his boots? Would you have seen that true influence isn't just about dictating terms, but about understanding and working with the complex interests of others? Or would you, like Napoleon, believe that sheer will could overcome economic gravity? Installing his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, it seemed, from your palace in Paris, a simple matter of administration, a logical extension of your system. Spain, a decadent Bourbon relic, ripe for the grafting of enlightened rule. You envisioned a smooth transition, a compliant satellite state, a further piece moved on the grand European chessboard. The year is 1808, and the ink is barely dry on the decree. Yet you feel a tremor beneath the smooth surface of your plan. It is the first sign of a seismic miscalculation, born of imperial arrogance, one that will bleed your empire dry. You believed you could simply decree loyalty, that the Spanish people would gratefully accept a foreign king, even your own flesh and blood. You underestimated the power of a nation's soul, the potent mix of faith, tradition, and fierce independence that flowed through the veins of every Spaniard. Instead of acceptance, you ignited a conflagration. The Spanish people rose, not as armies in ordered ranks you understood so well, but as 1,000 points of fire, peasants, priests, bandits, nobles, united by a visceral hatred for the invader. This wasn't war as you knew it. It was a brutal, protracted, merciless struggle. The Peninsular War began not with a grand battle, but with ambushes in mountain passes, assassinations in city streets, and the terrifying, unpredictable fury of a populace fighting for their very identity. Reports began to pile up, each one a fresh sting. Convoys ambushed, garrisons besieged, isolated units massacred. You sent marshals, you sent corps, hundreds of thousands of your finest veteran troops, men you desperately needed for the looming confrontations in Central Europe. They were swallowed by the Spanish landscape, tied down in costly sieges like Zaragoza, harried by elusive guerrilla bands, depleted by disease and constant low-level conflict. Spain became a running sore, a phrase you yourself might have used, constantly draining the lifeblood from the Grande Armée. A wound that refused to heal. It was a strategic black hole, consuming resources faster than they could be replenished, weakening your hand everywhere else. You saw the ferocity of Spanish resistance firsthand in battle reports. Civilians fighting alongside soldiers, women manning cannons, an entire nation mobilized not by decree, but by a burning, organic will. Here was the profound, blinding insight you missed. National pride and the will to resist foreign imposition are not rational, calculable factors. They are elemental forces that centralized, rationalist planning often fails entirely to account for. You understood armies, logistics, the geometry of the battlefield, but you underestimated the power of popular resistance, of cultural identity interwoven with religious fervor, of people willing to die not for an abstract concept of empire, but for their immediate patch of land, their traditions, their God. Your belief that you could simply decree loyalty, that the enlightened ideas you represented would trump centuries of ingrained identity and fierce independence, proved catastrophically, uniquely wrong. It was a failure to comprehend the human element on a national scale. Ask yourself, was this the moment your strategic brilliance succumbed to a fatal hubris? When the master of Europe forgot that even the grandest designs must respect the unpredictable soil they are built upon. What would you have done, standing in his boots, faced with a foe that refused to fight by the rules you wrote? Never underestimate the resolve of people fighting for their home and identity. Military might alone, however immense, cannot conquer the spirit of a nation, and attempts to impose one's will without a deep understanding of local contexts and values are often doomed to costly, draining failure. Spain became the constant, festering reminder of that truth, a bleeding wound that would plague your empire until its final breath. The year is 1810. You stand at the pinnacle of European power, but the gilded edges of your empire are beginning to fray. Beneath the surface of grand parades and diplomatic triumphs, a subtle, insidious fatigue is spreading. The continental system, your grand economic weapon against Britain, is a blunt instrument to carving hardship, not just into enemy shores, but into your own realm. Ports lie idle, merchants grumble, and goods grow scarce or prohibitively expensive. In bustling cities and quiet villages, the weight of economic stagnation fuels a quiet discontent, a resentment that whispers beneath the emperor's portraits. You orchestrated a marriage to the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise, a strategic masterstroke meant to legitimize your upstart dynasty by grafting it onto ancient Habsburg royalty. Yet, this union, so carefully calculated on maps and dynastic charts, lacks the popular warmth and romantic narrative that captivated France during the days of Josephine. It feels cold, a political necessity, rather than a symbol of hope, further alienating segments of the population who see it as another move on a cosmic chessboard where they are merely pawns. There's a tragic irony here. In seeking ultimate legitimacy through tradition, you underscore your own distance from the very people you rule. The endless demand for soldiers, for more campaigns, stretches the sinews of the empire thin. Conscription calls echo through the countryside, pulling sons from farms, husbands from workshops. Families already strained by economic hardship watch their loved ones march off, many never to return. Desertion rates, once a minor concern, climb steadily, a silent rebellion against the relentless drumbeat of war. Even your most loyal marshals, the men who have marched with you from the bridge at Arcole to the fields of Wagram, show signs of weariness. Their fortunes are made, their reputations forged in fire. But the constant risk, the grueling marches, the emperor's increasingly inflexible demands, they take their toll. The admiration is still there, perhaps, but mixed with a deep, bone-tired longing for peace, for rest. You sense this shift, a subtle change in the air. The way the crowd cheers a little less loudly. The way reports of unrest filter in. The boundless energy and unwavering confidence you project can no longer entirely mask the foundational cracks appearing beneath the grand facade. The insight dawns, the relentless pursuit of expansion and centralized control, while achieving grand strategic goals, places an unsustainable strain on the system and the people it governs. Ignoring these signs, the human and economic fatigue, is not just a strategic oversight. It's an erosion of the very foundation of popular support your power ultimately rests upon. Ask yourself, is the brilliance of command worth the cost of burnout? Sustainable leadership isn't just about winning battles. It's about listening to the whispers of discontent, managing the ongoing costs, and understanding the limits of human endurance and economic resilience. To ignore these signs of strain, both seen and unseen, is to invite the very collapse you strive so desperately to prevent. You stand on the border of empire in the spring of 1812, watching a human tidal wave gather. 600,000 men, the largest army Europe has ever marshaled, are arrayed before you. This is the Grand Army, forged in victory after victory, now pointed east. The target? Russia. The goal? Not conquest in the traditional sense, but coercion. Tsar Alexander I has proven frustratingly independent, chipping away at the continental system, daring to defy Napoleon's economic blockade of Britain. This invasion is meant to be a colossal, undeniable flexing of imperial muscle, forcing the Tsar back into line, asserting absolute, unquestionable dominance over the entire continent. You see the scale, the logistical nightmare unfolding even before the first shots are fired. Miles and miles of supply wagons, livestock, cannons, all trudging into the vast, empty distances of the Russian plains. This isn't just marching into battle, It's marching into geography itself. It's an attempt to subdue not an army or a capital, but space, climate, the sheer unyielding scale of an entire nation. Napoleon believes his will, his strategic genius, the sheer weight of his army, can bend reality to his command. The deep insight here is that supreme, unchecked power can breed a dangerous, almost divine overconfidence. When every obstacle for a decade has crumbled before you, you begin to believe no obstacle can withstand your force. The Russian campaign wasn't born primarily out of strategic necessity. Russia wasn't an imminent military threat, but from wounded pride and an inability to tolerate defiance. It was a punitive expedition on a scale never before attempted, a testament to an emperor who now believed his will could overcome not just armies, but the very elements. It shows the chilling consequence of believing you are invincible, that the rules of reality simply don't apply to you anymore. Look at this moment, this colossal gamble. Ask yourself, is this the pinnacle of strategic thinking, or the first fatal step of hubris? Consider the cold logic of survival versus the hot fever of ambition. The reflection etched into the snows of Russia is stark. Recognize when ambition crosses the line into pure recklessness. The biggest, most devastating failures often stem from the conviction that you are immune to natural laws, to logistical realities, to the simple, brutal facts of geography and climate. Humility before the scale and complexity of the world, acknowledging the limits of even the greatest will, is not a weakness. It is essential for survival, let alone sustained success. In 1812, Napoleon forgot this. He attempted to conquer the unconquerable, distance, winter, and a nation willing to burn its own path before him. The snow falls in relentless sheets, each flake a tiny, cold judgment upon an emperor's ambition. You stand on the edge of a frozen river, watching what was once the Grande Armée, the pride of Europe, the instrument of Napoleon's will, dissolve before your eyes. They are no longer soldiers. They are phantoms, wrapped in rags and stolen furs, stumbling through a white wasteland that swallows them whole. The magnificent cavalry is gone, its horses eaten or dead from exhaustion. The disciplined infantry marches no more. They shuffle, they crawl, they collapse into the drifts. This wasn't a strategic retreat. It was a death march, a relentless, brutal unwinding of power. The Russian winter, an enemy far more formidable than any opposing general, bites deep, freezing flesh, shattering morale. Behind them, the scorched earth policy of the retreating Russians has left nothing but ashes and ice, no shelter, no sustenance. And on the flanks, the Cossacks, like wolves, harry the edges, picking off the stragglers, turning desperation into outright panic. You see the bridges collapse, cutting off escape routes, forcing men into the freezing water. The sheer scale of the suffering is unimaginable. It wasn't a battle that broke them. It was the vast, indifferent expanse of Russia, the unyielding cold, and the slow, agonizing embrace of starvation. This is the brutal reality of hubris laid bare. Napoleon, the master of strategy, the man who bent kings and nations to his will, believed he could dictate terms to distance and climate. He believed his genius could outwit winter, that his logistics could span a continent that devoured armies. It was a fatal miscalculation, perhaps his most profound. He had planned for war against men. He found himself fighting a land that refused to yield, defended by a people who preferred ruin to surrender. And then, the emperor makes his move. He doesn't stay to suffer alongside his men, to lead the rear guard, to share their freezing fate. He leaves, rushing back to Paris, traveling incognito, a desperate dash to preserve his throne, to raise a new army from the depleted manpower of France. It was strategically necessary, perhaps, to secure his position, but it was a symbolic act of abandonment, witnessed by history. The leader departs while his followers perish in the snow. This retreat from Moscow wasn't just a military disaster, it was a moral collapse. It exposed the terrible cost of viewing human lives as mere pawns on a grand chessboard. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, sacrificed not on the altar of victory, but on the icy plains of a failed gamble. The aura of invincibility, so carefully cultivated on a dozen battlefields, was shattered here, fragmented like ice underfoot. Europe saw the man who claimed dominion over destiny brought low, not by a rival general, but by snow and empty barns. Ask yourself, what is the true cost of ambition when it blinds a leader to reality? What would you have felt watching the emperor's carriage speed away while your comrades froze beside you? This failure in Russia illuminates a timeless truth. The consequences of poor leadership, of grand misjudgment, are almost always borne most heavily by those who follow. Responsibility for such a catastrophe, for the lives lost in the name of a failed vision, is the heaviest burden of command, a weight the snow cannot bury. The ice of Russia has melted, but the chill remains, a stark reminder of the limits of ambition. You pushed your grand army to the brink, and the cost wasn't just the men lost to the snow, it was the perception of invincibility shattered. Now, a new fire is kindled across Europe, not by Napoleon's will, but by the embers of resentment he left behind. The nations he forced into reluctant alliance, the kingdoms bent under his iron heel, see their chance. A flicker becomes a flame. Prussia, humiliated and occupied, rises first, spurred by nationalistic fervor, ignited partly by the French Revolution's ideals, twisted and exported by Napoleon himself. Then Austria, your father-in-law's realm, your dynastic link, sees the strategic moment and joins the swelling tide. It's a chilling irony. The very structures of power you imposed now act as fault lines, ready to crack. You stand in a Europe fundamentally changed, not just by your dominance, but by the reaction to it. This momentum culminates in the autumn of 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations. It is not a single battle, but a vast, multi-day collision involving hundreds of thousands. You are no longer fighting isolated monarchs or divided armies. You face a coalition united by a common goal: your removal. Your forces, depleted from the Russian campaign, bolstered by young, inexperienced conscripts, Marie-Louises, they are tragically called, face seasoned veterans and surging national militias from Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and German states breaking free. It's like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a sieve. Look at the maps. The vast, red-inked empire you meticulously drew begins to contract. Client states, once your puppets, crumble almost as quickly as they were erected. The Kingdom of Westphalia dissolves. The Confederation of the Rhine unravels. Italy stirs. The edifice built on sheer force and calculated fear finds its foundations cracking under the collective weight of national identity and pent-up rage. This is the brutal lesson. Power built solely on dominance is inherently fragile, a structure held together by tension, not foundation. When the central force weakens, the parts held only by coercion fly apart. Your empire, for all its imposing grandeur, lacked the crucial glue of consent, shared interest, or genuine loyalty. It was a beautiful, terrible machine, powered by your will, but it could not run forever on resentment. Ask yourself, was the swiftness of the creation the very reason for the speed of the disintegration? Was this the inevitable consequence of ignoring the will of nations, believing bayonets could conquer hearts and minds? You are seeing the historical truth unfold. Lasting influence and stability are built on cooperation and mutual respect, not forced submission. Structures of power that disregard the identity and will of their components are, in the end, destined to shatter under pressure. The battle for Leipzig isn't just a defeat. It's the sound of an entire system, a forced reality, breaking apart. The final campaign in France is a desperate, fading ember against the rising tide of Europe. You fight with the brilliance of youth, but the odds are insurmountable. Your marshals, the instruments of your former glory, are weary. They are rich, they are titled, and they refuse to bleed further for an empire that crumbles around you. It is April 1814, and the inevitable shadow falls upon you at Fontainebleau. Picture the scene: the Grand Palace. Now a cage of gilded defeat. You sit before a simple table, quill in hand. The document before you is short, stark, the renunciation, not just of the throne, but of the identity you forged, the destiny you seized. You sign away the empire you built with blood and genius, the empire that ultimately consumed you. The scrape of the quill echoes in the silence, a death knell for a world you created. This isn't just a political act, it's an amputation of the self. Your first exile is Elba. Consider the brutal, almost cruel irony of this choice. You who ruled half a continent, who placed kings on thrones and redrew the map of nations, are granted a kingdom of a mere 93 square miles, emperor of a speck of dust in the vast, indifferent ocean. You arrive greeted by a tiny guard, a miniature court. This is the stage granted to the man who once commanded 1,000,000. The contrast is a psychological hammer blow. The solitude descends, heavy and suffocating, for a man whose life was a ceaseless storm of activity, a constant surge of command, decision, and movement. This enforced stillness is torture. The strategic maps on the wall mean nothing. There are no armies to move, no empires to conquer, only the mundane administration of a small island. The loss isn't just power, it's the loss of purpose, of the relentless forward momentum that defined your very existence. You are a caged lion, pacing a too small enclosure, the echo of distant roars haunting your ears. This period highlights a profound truth about absolute power, its incredible loneliness. Especially when it evaporates. The sycophants vanish, the advisors disappear, the constant demands cease. You are left with only yourself and the weight of your decisions. All the trappings of authority, the palaces, the titles, the armies, disappear, leaving the individuals starkly exposed to the consequences. The fall from absolute control to utter powerlessness is perhaps the most brutal lesson history offers about the ephemeral nature of worldly might. Yet, even in Elba, the ambition simmers. The inability to accept this quiet end, this diminished stage, is palpable. It leads to the desperate, audacious gamble known as the 100 Days. You return to France, welcomed initially by a weary populace and a hesitant army. It is a final, furious burst of energy, a last attempt to defy gravity. But it is doomed from the start. The powers of Europe have learned. They are united, and the resources are simply not there. This brief, frantic period is less a triumphant return and more a tragic, predictable epilogue, born purely of an inability to reconcile yourself to defeat and lost power. The test of character is often revealed not in triumph, but in how one faces defeat and the loss of control. What do you do when the roar of the crowd is gone, when the armies march away, when you are left alone with the consequences? The reflection here is stark. Measure success not just by the heights you reach, but by the person you become on the journey, and the grace and wisdom you can muster when power inevitably fades. Was the flight from Elba a display of unbreakable will, or simply the stubborn refusal of a man addicted to control to accept reality? Ask yourself, what would you do, stripped of everything you built? Section 17. The echo of ambition rings through the cold air, and you stand in the aftermath. You've watched him rise, a whirlwind from the revolution's chaos, a savior consolidating power as first consul. Now you see the inevitable transformation, the casting aside of even the pretense of republicanism. He doesn't just take the throne, he creates it for himself. December 2nd, 1804 isn't just a date. It's the moment ambition sheds its last disguise and declares itself sovereign. In Notre Dame, under the gaze of Pope Pius VII, who believed he was there to bestow divine right, Napoleon takes the imperial crown and places it upon his own head. It's a gesture screaming, "My authority comes not from God, not from the people, but from me and me alone." This act, crowning himself emperor, is the ultimate embodiment of unchecked ambition. It wasn't merely a change in title, it was a spiritual and philosophical shift, elevating his will to the level of destiny itself. He tailored that garment of fate, placed that crown, believing his vision, his genius, was the only necessary guide. You see the magnificent outcomes, the Code Napoleon, a legal framework that still influences civil law worldwide, the reshaping of European borders that swept away centuries of feudal dust, grand infrastructure projects. He breathes new life into a fractured France, instilling pride, order, and a sense of purpose after years of revolutionary turmoil. But you also see the horrifying destruction, the endless wars that bleed Europe white, the millions dead on battlefields from Austerlitz to Borodino, the ruthless suppression of dissent, the satellite kingdoms placed under the rule of his often incompetent family members. The path of absolute control, paved with brilliant reforms and terrifying human cost, leads not to lasting peace or universal admiration, but to isolation and an ever-increasing dependency on military force. The surprising, terrifying insight is how quickly the savior becomes the solitary figure, trusting only his own judgment, growing deaf to counsel that doesn't mirror his desires. He wasn't just a military genius. He was a man who proved how seductively power can warp perspective, how the belief in one's own infallibility can become a fatal addiction. His transition to emperor reveals a blueprint for future leaders in turbulent times. Promise stability, deliver order, often ruthlessly, accumulate power, marginalize opposition, and eventually embark on grand, often reckless ventures fueled by pride rather than genuine strategic wisdom. You see echoes of this pattern ripple throughout history. Charismatic figures stepping onto unstable stages, promising everything, taking control, and ultimately collapsing under the weight of their own ego. Ask yourself, when does the unwavering belief in your own capabilities become a dangerous delusion? Where is the line between necessary strength and corrosive hubris? Standing in his boots in 1804, knowing what comes after, would you have resisted the crown? Or would the roar of power have drowned out the whisper of caution? This section of his life is a stark, chilling lesson. The ambition to lead, to build, to achieve is a powerful human fire. But unchecked, unburdened by accountability, and fueled by an isolating certainty in one's own rightness, it doesn't merely scorch. It consumes everything, including the one who wields it. The fall isn't just a consequence. It's baked into the ascent when that ascent is fueled solely by self-exaltation. Reflective close. You feel the cold wind of history sweep over you now, carrying the faint, persistent echo of cannon fire and shattered dreams. Napoleon, reflecting from the lonely rock of St. Helena, stripped of empire, stripped of power, offered a final, haunting self-assessment, perhaps unintentional in its brutal honesty. Ambition is never satisfied, even unto death. His life, from the dusty Corsican boy to the self-crowned emperor to the prisoner on an island, is a potent, tragic epic. It reminds us that while ambition can fuel the construction of empires, it is often the inability to restrain, to question, to temper that ambition with self-awareness and accountability that leads not merely to defeat, but to utter collapse. The big lesson etched in the rise and fall of Napoleon's star is the perilous nature of unchecked will. Power reveals, and absolute power often reveals absolute isolation and a fatal blindness. When judgment is eclipsed by ego, when the mirror only reflects greatness, the path leads inevitably to exile, not to lasting empire. You see the pattern, a blueprint of aspiration turned to destruction, repeated across centuries and continents. And you are left to ponder your own ambition, the desire to lead, to build, to make your mark. It burns, doesn't it? Napoleon's life serves as a stark reminder of the price paid when that flame is allowed to rage without boundary or self-awareness. It's not just about conquering nations, it's about conquering yourself. Studying his fall doesn't diminish his achievements. It illuminates the human condition. It teaches us that true greatness requires not just the will to ascend, but the wisdom to know when and how to restrain the very force that propelled you upwards. In the end, perhaps it wasn't the coalition armies that truly defeated him. It was believing he was invincible.